January 1640, frozen forests of northeastern North America. In that region, when the cold dropped below 40 degrees below zero, no one walked without thick hides on their feet. No one left the fire unattended. No one built too high. Hardwood cracked. Stone shattered. Winter punished excesses. Still on the edge of the village, a man insisted on erecting a structure that was too long to appear prudent. It's going to collapse. It can't withstand the wind. It's crazy to heat that up. He didn't argue. While others reinforced small, compact huts, he measured the ground for something that seemed excessive. 2 parallel rows of young stakes, too green to appear sturdy. Slender trees, not ancient giants. And at the center of the project, too much space for a single fire. When the first snowfall hit the forest and the air began to burn inside their lungs, the question ceased to be whether this was strange. The question then became, how could 100 people survive in there without suffocating? And why, years later, would that building be seen as the invisible model of an entire nation? Winter wasn't a season. It was a period of restraint. The families of that region, part of the people we now know as Haudenosaunee, knew that every mistake made in the spring would exact a price in January. Smaller huts were the norm, compact structures, a single fire, low roofs to conserve heat. The principle was simple. The smaller the space, the easier it was to keep it alive. That's how it's always been. But Takari didn't always follow. He wasn't the oldest. He wasn't the boss. He wasn't a renowned hunter. He worked in silence, chopped more wood than necessary, watched the wind as if listening to someone speak. The previous spring, when the sap rose in the trees, he chose neither the thick oaks nor the old, rigid trunks. He chose young trees, sticks the thickness of a fist. Some people laughed. A house made of branches? It will bend with the first gust of wind. He continued. He cut at the right season, when the wood was still alive inside, when it could be bent without splintering. He piled the thin logs beside the cleared land. No one understood why so many. The standard was rigidity. He was looking for flexibility. When he planted the 2 parallel rows in the ground, the village watched. The shape was unusual. It wasn't circular like the old houses. It wasn't low. It stretched out like a corridor. Too long. An elder commented, not angrily, just skeptically, "Heat is lost in a vacuum." Takari did not respond. Days later, men climbed onto makeshift scaffolding. They grasped the ends of the poles and pulled toward the center. The effort was risky. Green wood groans before it gives way. If it dries out too much, it breaks like bone. A stake cracked. Short laughs. But most bowed down. When the ends met at the top, they were tied together with inner strips of damp bark. As they dried, they would harden. Not like stone, like tendon. The skeleton emerged. It looked like the belly of an animal lying in the snow. Some stopped laughing, but there was still greater doubt. The winter there was unforgiving. Winds from the Great Lakes swept through the forest like long blades. The temperature not only dropped, it became brutal. Most people prepared firewood stores for their own use. Takari organized collective piles. More laughter. Who will share the fire in the dead of night? The concept of sharing heat seemed too fragile for that latitude. And there was another detail that bothered me. The interior would have no rigid divisions, no walls isolating families, continuous platforms along the sides, an open central space, living together too much. When the first layer of elm bark was installed, removed in the spring and pressed under stones to prevent it from curling, the structure began to take real shape. Overlapping scales from base to top. From a distance, it seemed too light to withstand the heavy snow, but the true risk had not yet been tested. In the center of the corridor, Takari dug not one, but several fires. Spaced out. Aligned. This created a different kind of silence. It was no longer laughter, it was calculation. Multiple bonfires in an enclosed space meant a slow death. Smoke doesn't negotiate. A young man commented quietly, "He's going to cook us from the inside out." Takari listened. He didn't correct her. When they cut out the small rectangular openings in the roof, the criticism returned. Holes through which the cold enters. But he watched the wind. He adjusted bark flaps with long sticks. He tested invisible currents even before the snow arrived. Meanwhile, other huts were being reinforced with thick logs. Heavy. Strong. Too strong to bend. The forest didn't seem threatening yet, but everyone knew it was only a matter of time. The normal world was established. Small houses, individual fires, rigidity. Takari built the opposite. Wide open spaces, collective warmth, wood that yielded. The question grew silently among the families. He was creating a protective barrier, or are we preparing a disaster that would involve everyone? And when the first birds migrated south and the air began to dry before the snow, no one laughed anymore, but nobody trusted them yet. When the first ice sealed the riverbanks, the structure was already standing. Too long, too high, too quiet. There was no paint, there was no ornament, just bent wood and overlapping bark planks like fish scales. The other dwellings seemed solid, compact, reliable. That seemed daring. Takari didn't announce any changes. He didn't call a meeting. He simply began moving his own family inside. First, the baskets of dried corn, then the skins, then the firewood. His wife didn't ask anything. She just helped. That was the second reason for the strangeness. It was uncommon for a family to abandon the structure that had protected generations. Individual warmth provided a sense of control. There, control would be collective. A neighboring family was watching. When the smoke clears, he'll understand. But winter didn't start violently. It started slowly. First light snows, short winds, long dawns, and then the invisible test. On the first night that the temperature dropped below bearable levels, Takari lit 3 fires in the central corridor. 3, not 10. The fire rose. The smoke rose with it. The openings in the ceiling were partially closed. The air current was pulling the excess air out, but not completely. A gray layer began to form above, stationary and thick. At eye level, the air remained clean. Someone came in, coughed, left. It's going to fill up. But it didn't fill up. The smoke settled. It hung suspended like a living ceiling. On the ground, the cold ran heavy. You could feel it on your shins, like invisible, icy water. But the side platforms were above him. Takari didn't sleep that night. He stayed up watching the movement of the air, adjusting the outer flaps with a long pole whenever the wind changed. At dawn, the structure was not damp inside. There was no ice on the interior walls. There was no condensation on the skins. That caught my attention. On the second coldest day, he lit 5 bonfires. Nothing exploded. No one suffocated. But a minor problem arose. One of the tie-down joints began to crack under the weight of the accumulated snow. A short sound. Dry. Those who listened remembered the stake that had broken months before. If that joint were to give way, the arch could become misaligned. If it became misaligned, the weight of the snow would concentrate its force. And if it concentrated, the longhouse could fall like dominoes. Takari Subiu, alone. The outer surface was slippery. The snow was still light, but increasing. He adjusted the position of an external beam that pressed the shell against the internal structure. He tightened the ties that had loosened due to the moisture. He got off without announcing it. The sound stopped. Some people started to notice a pattern. The structure wasn't fighting against the wind. It was moving with it. In the 3rd week of intense cold, another family lost part of the roof of their smaller cabin. The thick wood didn't bend. It broke. The wind came in. The fire went out. They spent that night crammed into a relative's house. The following morning, the man from that family walked to the long structure. He didn't ask for shelter. He simply asked, "How much space is left?" Takari pointed to an empty platform. No speech. The first migration began there. But sharing the fire means sharing responsibility. And this had not yet been tested under real pressure. The snow hadn't yet come in en masse. The great wind had not yet arrived. And there was a detail that few people noticed. The more families that came in, but human warmth altered the internal balance. If the airflow failed, it wouldn't just be discomfort. It would be fatal. The sky darkened for 2 days before the actual storm arrived. The animals hid early. The wind changed direction 3 times in a single afternoon. The older generation knew what that meant. On the first night of heavy snowfall, 10 campfires were lit. Now it was a full test. The hallway glowed in deep orange hues. Shadows danced on the bark walls. Children slept in bearskins. The smell of dry burning wood mingled with the scent of roasted corn, and above, the ceiling of smoke thickened. Takari adjusted the outer flaps repeatedly. North closed, south open, then reversed, then partially both. It was constant calculation. So the least unexpected thing, one of the newly arrived families placed still damp firewood on the fire. The smoke changed its behavior. He went down. Little, but it went down. Their eyes met. The air grew heavier. A child started coughing. Takari walked slowly down the corridor. He removed the unsuitable firewood. He replaced it with wood that had been stored under the platforms, pre-dried by the constant heat. The smoke rose again, but the message was clear. That required collective discipline. Without it, the system would fail. At the height of the storm, the wind struck the east side with sustained force. The entire structure tilted several centimeters. Deep moans echoed through the bonds. A woman held her son closer. Nobody ran outside. There was nowhere to run. The wood bent, and he returned. Snow accumulated on the curved top and slid down the sides. If it had been a flat roof, it would have collapsed. But it wasn't. Hours later, another problem arose. The cold found its way to the base of one of the walls where the bark met the ground. A small crack, invisible during the day. A current of cold air began to seep in. Nothing dramatic, but constant. Takari realized this because he saw a sail swaying differently. He stepped outside into the biting wind. He covered the base with an additional layer of bark and compacted earth. He came back with ice on his eyebrows. He simply said, "More land there." The system was strong, but it wasn't perfect. Every small mistake needed to be corrected before it became a big one. In the early morning of the third day of the storm, the longhouse was full. 100 people are breathing. 10 bonfires with deep embers. A thick layer of smoke high above acts as a thermal ceiling. Outside, the temperature plummeted below 40 below zero. Inside, it was possible to walk barefoot for a few seconds without immediate pain. It wasn't comfortable. It was functional survival. When the storm subsided, the silence was heavy. The smaller huts were partially buried. 2 had collapsed. The long structure remained, slightly displaced, but intact. There was no celebration, just a reorganization. More families requested space, and now the risk increased. Because the more people there are, the most difficult part would be maintaining the invisible balance that held everything together. Winter had not yet shown its worst. The first major storm served as a warning, not as a limit. With more families inside the structure, the pace changed. The corridor was no longer just shelter. It was a compressed community. Children ran short distances. Women worked side by side. Men went in and out to fetch firewood, always in pairs. Discipline began to relax. Small details went unnoticed. One of the side platforms was extended to accommodate a new family. In doing so, they moved part of the pile of firewood that was underneath it. Wood that was there precisely to dry in the constant heat. Some logs were placed too close to one of the campfires. Nobody noticed on the first day. In the second case, the wood began to dry out too quickly. On the third night of continuous extreme cold, the wind returned. Not a full-blown blizzard. A dry, cutting, constant wind. Takari was sleeping less and less. He adjusted the ceiling vents almost instinctively. The airflow was steady. The layer of smoke remained high, acting as a thermal ceiling. Then the mistake happened. A log was discreetly rolled closer to the central fire pit. There was no high flame. There was slow ignition. The base of the platform started to overheat. The smell came first. Not visibly burning wood, overheating wood. A woman noticed. She called softly. When Takari arrived, he saw a small tongue of fire rising up the side support of the platform. It wasn't big, but it was in the wrong structural location. If that flame were to rise through the internal structure, it would reach the dry fastenings of the main arch. What if the ropes burned? The ceiling would lose tension. With 100 people inside. Without making a fuss, Takari pulled the log away using a wooden hook. Another man threw compacted earth onto the glowing base. Not water. Water would freeze too quickly and make the floor slippery. The flame was extinguished, but the damage was done. One of the upper ties directly above the heat source had begun to dry out more than ideally. It had become too rigid, and rigid wood, under strong wind, does not bend. It cracks. The following morning, with the wind blowing from the side, the sound was heard. A dry crackling sound from above. It wasn't high, but it was different. Some woke up. Takari too. He climbed up immediately through the interior, using the crossbeams for support. Up above, the layer of smoke stung his eyes, but he was already familiar with that environment. He found the tie-up to be too tight. If it were to give way completely, the arch would lose its alignment. It wouldn't collapse immediately, but it would create structural deformation. Under the weight of accumulated snow, this could initiate a chain reaction. He couldn't wait for dawn. He carefully cut away the damaged part. He substituted it with a moist strip of bark that he had saved for emergencies. He worked in the dark, Above the breathable airline, holding his breath when necessary. Below, nobody was shouting. Nobody was running. Trust was beginning to exist, but it was still fragile. As they got off the bus, a child simply asked, "Is it going to fall?" He replied, "No," and he returned to his post near the roof openings. But the near disaster left an invisible mark. If the fire had risen a few centimeters higher, if the wind had been stronger, if the mooring were to break under full load, there would be no second chance. The following morning, Takari reorganized the entire area under the platforms. He created a greater distance between the firewood and the fire. He established a silent rule. New wood could only be brought in after spending days under indirect heat. He didn't make a speech. Only the layout has changed. And everyone understood. But Winter still had a reserve of strength, and this time it wouldn't be a small mistake. It would be a difficult decision. 2 weeks later, the cold reached its lowest point of the winter. There was no wind. There was no snowstorm. Just still, brutal air. When air doesn't move, it seeps in. That night, the outside temperature exceeded any recent record. The foundation of the structure began to suffer. The frozen ground receded slightly. Minor displacements occurred where the stakes were driven in, nothing visible from a distance. But inside, the voltage difference began to alter the balance of the openings in the ceiling. The airflow changed, almost imperceptible. The smoke began to descend a few centimeters. First, nobody noticed. Then the burning sensation in my eyes came on earlier than usual. A young child, the son of one of the families who migrated after losing their hut, began to cough continuously. It wasn't just discomfort, it would be insufficient. If the smoke layer descended any further, the entire system would lose functionality. Opening the vents in the roof too much would allow extreme cold air to enter directly. Closing them too much would trap the smoke. It was a delicate balance. Takari went outside. The cold was so intense that his breath felt like it was going to suffocate in his chest. He adjusted the north flap completely. The non-existent wind didn't help create natural suction. He went back inside. The smoke was not rising yet. He looked down the entire hallway. 100 people. Increasing the size of campfires could create a stronger updraft, but it could also increase the risk of rapid oxygen depletion. Reducing fires would keep the air cleaner, but would allow for a sharp drop in temperature. He made the decision without explaining. He ordered 2 bonfires to be reduced in size. Immediate silence. The heat has noticeably decreased. Some felt the cold creep up their legs, but the column of air began to reorganize itself. The smoke rose slowly. Not enough. Then he did something he had never done before. He briefly opened the main door, creating a controlled cross-current. The sharp air entered like a blade. Those closest to them felt the immediate impact, but the airflow pushed the smoke upwards, restoring the upper thermal layer. He closed it quickly. The child stopped coughing. But now the risk was different. The temporary drop in temperature could cause superficial frostbite on the extremities of those who are most vulnerable. A woman brought her son closer to the remaining fire. Nobody complained. Hours later, the system stabilized. There was no visible victory, just continuity. The following morning, Takari went out to check the outer stakes. Some were more tense than ideal. He mentally marked which ones would need to be replaced in the spring. It became clear then. The structure wasn't perfect. It required constant maintenance, permanent flexibility, and perhaps that was precisely what made it different from the rigid cabins that had collapsed weeks before. But winter was not yet over, and now something bigger was beginning to stir in the forest. Not the weather, the need. More nearby villages were beginning to face shortages, and soon, someone who had laughed before would step onto that doorway not to observe, but to ask. The prolonged cold did something that no storm had ever done. He emptied the reserves. Hunting became scarce. Trails disappeared under hardened ice. Traps returned empty. Some neighboring villages began consuming wood faster than they could replenish it. Small cabins, which seemed safe because they concentrated heat, now faced another problem, a single point of failure. If the fire went out, everything would go out. In the latter half of winter, 3 men appeared on the edge of the village. They knew each other. Months earlier, they had openly laughed at the long structure. Wind corridor, a house where you can lose heat. Now don't laugh. They didn't arrive speaking loudly. They arrived with measured steps, their shoulders tense from the cold and from necessity. One of them didn't look directly at Takari when he spoke. "We've run out of firewood." It was not a formal request. It was a fact. Behind them, women and children waited at a distance near a hut whose sidewall already showed signs of deterioration. The wind that week was coming from the west, steady, cold, and dry. If their structure collapsed that night, there wouldn't be time to rebuild. Takari did not respond immediately. He observed the horizon, as he did before each change of wind. Then he pointed to the entrance of the longhouse. No comment on the past, no memory of the laughter, just space. The families entered cautiously, some carrying nearly empty baskets, others bringing what remained of their hides. The hallway was already full. Physical space was limited, but thermal space still existed. Each new body added heat. Each new potential mistake added risk. Discipline would need to be greater than ever. One of the newly arrived women tried to rekindle an additional fire on her own, fearing that the heat wouldn't be enough for everyone. Takari held the stick she was using. Not forcefully, firmly. Not here. He reorganized the distribution of firewood. It reduced the size of some of the flames. Security was increased at the openings in the roof. The balance was now more fragile than at any time before. But something had changed. The same men who had previously doubted began to help adjust the outer flaps. They climbed to the top during strong winds. They learned to listen to the sound of the bindings. They learned to distinguish between structural cracking and superficial cracking. There was no apology, but there was a different kind of silence, undeclared respect. On one of the longest nights, when the cold plunged back below 40 degrees below zero, the entire structure creaked under a combination of crosswind and accumulated ice weight. Everyone woke up, not out of panic, out of conscience. 100 people breathing together, a few more. The ceiling flexed. The ropes tightened. A small crack opened in one of the outer shell plates, allowing a thin stream of frozen air to enter. One of the men who had laughed earlier was the first to notice. Without hesitation, he went outside with another strip of bark and compacted soil. He closed the crack before the cold could seep in continuously. When he returned, the ice in his beard glistened in the light of the embers. He looked at Takari. He didn't say anything, but it was no longer laughter. It was an understanding. The longhouse was not just shelter. It was a shared responsibility. That night, no outer cabin collapsed. No child went without warmth. No campfire was left unattended. And when the faint dawn appeared on the horizon, they were all still there. No celebration, no shouting, just alive. Winter was beginning to recede, but the mark of that period would not be forgotten. When the thaw began, there was no immediate reconstruction of the smaller huts. Many decided to stay, not because the longhouse was more comfortable, but because it had proven to be more stable. With the return of spring, some stakes were replaced. Outer bark panels were renewed. The structure was never finished. It was always being adjusted. The forced coexistence of winter revealed something greater than just construction technique. The model was revealed. Inside, decisions had to be collective. An individual mistake affected everyone. A correct adjustment benefited everyone. The clan mothers, central figures in the social organization of the Haudenosaunee, began to use that physical disposition as a constant metaphor. A single house, lots of fireworks, shared responsibility. This principle resonated beyond the village. Years later, when the 5 nations, Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, strengthened the Iroquois Confederacy, the image used was not that of walls or fortresses. It was that of a long, invisible house. East Gate, guarded by the Mohawk. West Gate, guarded by the Seneca family. Central fire maintained by the Onondaga. It was not an empty metaphor. It was architecture transformed into politics. Centuries later, European observers would study this system of representation and balance. Some scholars argue that certain principles influenced debates that helped shape what would become the United States. But in that spring of 1642, none of that was being discussed. What mattered was simple. No one had died that winter, and those who laughed learned without being humiliated. Takari did not become chief. He did not receive a title. He continued chopping wood at the correct time. He continued watching the wind before the others. The difference was subtle. When he planted a new stake, there was no more laughter. There was help. The longhouse did not survive the winter. She put up with it, and by enduring, he taught. In the end, it wasn't strength that kept the house standing. It was the ability to compromise. While other structures resisted until they broke, That one survived because it allowed itself to move with the wind. There was no marble. There was no metal. There were no promises of permanence. Only green wood that knew how to bend. Shared fire. And people who learned sooner or later that surviving in extreme cold doesn't depend on isolation. It depends on balance. And in that frozen forest of 1640, Winter was not defeated. He was listened to.